Today we'll be taking our first look at the Tier 8 premium Italian battleship Marco Polo. You can see my build for the ship here on the screen, and note that Marco Polo comes with a 5th module slot in which you can put a free module that converts your main guns into shooting AP and semi-armor piercing rather than AP and HE. So this is the first Italian battleship with SAP main guns. My commander is Xarkun for the increased accuracy, because it seems like when you've got this module on here for the SAP main guns, it makes the main guns not super accurate. And as a consequence, I don't really care for this ship. Maybe that's because I haven't played it enough and gotten enough good games with it, or maybe I haven't figured out how to play it optimally yet. That could very well be the case. But I much prefer Marlborough over this ship. Although I think there are going to be a lot of people who see things the complete opposite way as me. So if you're going to pick the Marco Polo and you're going to run it with the SAP module, then what do you get? Let's talk about the stats. Keep in mind that they will be influenced by the build and the commander skills that I showed you earlier. The Marco Polo's HP pool, 69,100. Very nice indeed. Actually, I think kind of low for a Tier 8 battleship, but it's an Italian battleship, so it's very, very well armored. The artillery, the piece de resistance on this ship, if you will. 9 16-inch guns, 406 millimeters. They've got an 18.1 km range, and they reload in 31.7 seconds with the reload module installed. Otherwise, if you're running the SAP module and you don't have the reload module, you're looking at somewhere near a 35-second reload. Turret traverses quick at 32 seconds, and the maximum AP alpha strike is 13,050, which I think is a little bit low, maybe, for 16-inch guns. Actually, no, I think that's right in line with the rest of the 16-inch guns in the game. But the SAP Alpha Strike, 14,100. And let's talk a little bit about SAP as we shoot it into La Foudre over there for nearly 14,000 damage. What is SAP? Because I think that's a question a lot of people are going to have. Why would you use SAP, and how does it work? Semi-armor piercing is a little bit like both high explosive and armor piercing. It sort of mixes the best of both worlds when it comes to those two shell types. Like high explosive, SAP has a set armor penetration value. Generally, you find that penetration value for HE by taking the caliber in millimeters of the HE shell and dividing by 6. That gives you a set armor threshold that your HE shells can penetrate, and they'll penetrate that armor threshold regardless of the angle of the armor and regardless of distance. SAP works in sort of the same way, although it's got a much higher pen value than HE. I think the SAP on the 16-inch guns can pen well over 100 millimeters of armor. So that means if they hit a 100 millimeter surface of armor, they will penetrate almost regardless of the angle. SAP can still ricochet like AP, but the ricochet angles are very, very steep. I think SAP only starts ricocheting somewhere around like the 15-degree mark, or it's something really severe like that. Otherwise, if the armor is thin enough, the SAP will penetrate. It will never over-penetrate. It will always give full penetrations. Sometimes it can hit citadels, but it needs to be on very lightly armored cruisers. And basically, it just does good, consistent damage, much like HE does, except it's got an alpha strike comparable to AP. And in the Marco Polo's case, the alpha strike on the SAP is greater than the alpha strike on the AP. So you would shoot it at the more lightly armored sections or more lightly armored ships like cruisers. The SAP is absolutely devastating to them, and you'll see that a little bit later in the video. But against destroyers, the SAP is much less devastating. If because the sap only gets full penetrations, if it were allowed to do full penetration damage to destroyers from guns of this size, even one shell would be catastrophic to the destroyers. So as a result, Wargaming has chosen to balance the sap for the Marco Polo's guns the same way they balance the sap on the main battery guns from the Italian battleships on PC. The sap can only do 10% of its alpha strike against destroyers from the main battery guns of sap-shooting battleships. So essentially, it does over-penetration damage like AP does against destroyers. Every time against destroyers. It will never get a full penetration, it will only get an over-penetration. So you're looking at like 1.4k damage per shell to a destroyer, with your sap alpha strike being 14,000. That's not great. That's not much better than AP overpens will get you. So you really have to hope that a lot of your shells are going to hit the destroyers. Otherwise, there's not much you can do to them. And unlike the tech tree line of Italian battleships, Marco Polo does not have sap secondaries. It only has HE secondaries. And it does have 12 152mm guns, which can damage destroyers with their high explosive shells, but the rest of the secondaries, in fact the majority of them, are 90mm secondaries. There's 24 of those, and 90mm HE isn't even going to penetrate the hulls of destroyers. So really, this battleship is a lot more hamstrung than the main line of Italian battleships, or even the other premium Italian battleships, if you choose to use the sap module to get sap out of the main guns. Otherwise, you can take HE and AP, and if you do that, the HE is obviously going to be more effective against destroyers because it can full pen them and do much more damage than a sap shell can. But the sap is still pretty darn good. We're not going to see that until a little bit later on, though. We get a good shot there against the enemy Marco Polo. You can see 3 sap shells for like 11,000 damage. You can just imagine what happens if you get more than 3 shells to land. But again, the dispersion on these guns is not necessarily going to allow you to do that consistently. It really couldn't. Otherwise, I think this ship would be massively overpowered. The AA defenses will gloss over because who cares? Maneuverability on the ship, 32 knot top speed, which is pretty nice. 860 meter turning circle, not huge, but not as small as some other battleships. And 17.7 or 17.5 second rudder shift time, which is a little bit on the slower side for battleships. There, by the way, you saw that shot against the Azuma with 4 sap penetrations. That was like 20,000 damage. And we're going to do it again to another one of these cruisers or battleships over here. But on to the last part of the stats page, concealment. I, of course, have Kondo as one of my inspirations and the concealment module. So I've got 12.8 km, which is pretty good. One thing I haven't mentioned so far, though, is that Marco Polo does get the rolling smoke, or the exhaust smoke generator, that provides you a moving smoke screen that stays with you while you're going full speed. I think you saw me use it earlier on in this battle, and that smoke screen is nice. It can be a get-out-of-jail-free card if you need to disengage. It can block the enemies from seeing you if you have to cross a gap broadside and you don't want to take any shots from them. There's a lot of possibilities that this smoke screen opens, and it's very nice to have. But as far as how the Marco Polo plays, I think it probably excels at medium to closer ranges. It is an Italian battleship. It's exceptionally well armored, and so it seems to be pretty good for brawling situations, like the situation we're taking it into here. And I think the exhaust smoke generator can help you get into those brawling type situations where you can be quite effective at close range. The sap is absolutely devastating to cruisers of pretty much any kind. They can't really angle against it. It will absolutely wreck them, as it did the Azuma. It's less effective against destroyers than cruiser sap, and it can be fairly effective against battleships. But with certain battleships, you're not going to have as easy of a time penetrating them with the sap as others. The battleships you want to look out for are the Germans, the Russians, and the Italians. All of them have very heavy armor in certain places, and a lot of that armor is simply going to shatter your sap. However, if you're facing American, British, French battleships, all of those can be absolutely devastated by this sap. And if you run into situations where you get broadsides from cruisers or battleships, the AP is going to be your best friend, because the sap is probably just going to shatter on the citadel belts of the majority of the larger capital ships that you might shoot at. So you want to switch to the AP to penetrate their citadel and do as much damage as you can. You definitely want to switch shells for the optimum targets and optimum angles in this ship. And basically, I think the general rule of thumb should be, if you get a broadside whose citadel you can penetrate, shoot AP at that broadside. Otherwise, shoot sap at more angled targets or bow tanking targets and the like. You're going to want to aim in the same sort of places as you would aim HE with the sap, though. So if you've got like a bow tanking battleship, you're going to want to aim above the guns and into the superstructure. And if you do, you're guaranteed full penetrations, no overpens ever with sap. Basically, good consistent damage like HE, but with the alpha strike of AP. And as a consequence, I think that all goes into making the Marco Polo a very unique ship. It's very unlike any of the other Italian battleships in the game thus far, because it's the first with sap main guns, and I think that is an attractive selling point. Plus, as you've seen here, you can do a very respectable amount of damage with both the sap and the armor piercing, and you can utilize the smokescreen generator to get into interesting positions and engage or disengage with the enemy in ways that would be impossible to battleships without this kind of smokescreen. One thing you do need to keep in mind, though, when you use the smokescreen, is that your smoke firing penalty, since you're a battleship, is absolutely gigantic. The detectability when firing the main guns inside of a smoke screen is 15.1 kilometers, which means that if you deploy a smoke screen, basically anytime you do that, you're going to have to be sure to not be shooting your guns, or you're just going to be spotted. By the way, you can see just how devastating the sap is against a target with not a lot of armor, like that aircraft carrier out there. But yeah, 15.1 kilometer smoke firing penalty. If you've just fired your guns and you deploy a smoke screen, you'll be spotted. What you want to do is wait until your smoke firing penalty goes away after firing your guns, and you can tell that by looking at the minimap. Anytime you fire your guns, your detection blooms out to the same range as your guns, and then when the smoke firing penalty is over, your detectability ring, which turns orange when it blooms out, turns back to blue and gets smaller to your normal concealment range. When you see that, you know you're no longer under the smoke firing penalty, and you can deploy a smoke screen. But yeah, the Marco Polo is an interesting ship. I still think I like the Marlborough better, but this is definitely not a bad ship to get if you want to choose it over the Marlborough in the campaign. Hope you enjoyed this video. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.